and normal morality can stop it. So when does plunder stop? When it's more painful and more dangerous than labor. That's when plunder stops. Hence the reason for law. The proper purpose of law is to use the power of collective force to stop the fatal tendency to plunder instead of work. All the measure of the law should be to protect plunder and punish plunder. The legitimate purpose of law is to punish and eliminate plunder. Plunder of my life, plunder of my property, plunder of my resources. Law cannot operate without the sanction and support of the dominating force. The force is entrusted to those who make the laws. Guns and jails. Guns and jails. Guns and jails are the force needed for law to have its effect. You remove the guns and jails, there's no force and effect of law. Come on, you guys don't obey the law because it's a moral thing to do. You obey the law because you'll go to jail if you don't. Especially when you live in a communist country. Why do you think the German people didn't uprise against Adolf Hitler? Because they'd be shot if they did. Why didn't the Russian people, why didn't the Soviet Union, the people of Red China? Because they'd be shot if they did. So right now we're moving into a time when force is being used to enforce the law, but if the law itself is perverted, then we're being forced into a situation that is very uncomfortable. This fact, combined with a fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the nearly universal perversion of the law. It is easy to understand how law, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. Okay. It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislature to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, liberty by oppression, and their profit by plunder. Now, men naturally rebel against the injustice of which they are victims. When plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter by peaceful or revolutionary means into the making of laws. So you got two parties, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, and they're both now vying for the control of the machine of plunder, and so it's just a matter of degree because the machine itself has been set up to sanction and legalize plunder. So according to the degree of the Enlightenment, these plundered classes may propose one of two entirely different purposes when they attempt to gain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. So with these people that we're electing into office, what do they really want? They just want a piece of the pie, they want a piece of the action, they want to enjoy the aristocracy that's plundering the masses, or do they really want to reverse the trend of American ism, which is becoming communism and fascism and totalitarianism? These are the questions. Woe to the nation when the latter purpose prevails among the mass victims of lawful plunder, when they in turn seize power to make laws. So now we have a class of individual sitting in the Oval Office that is championing people that really want a free lunch. And that free lunch is coming through the process of legal plunder of the masses.
Redistribution.
Until that happens, the few practice lawful plunder on the many, a common practice where the right to participate in the making of laws is limited to a few persons. But then participation in the making of law becomes universal. And then men seek to balance their conflicting interests by universal plunder. Instead of rooting out the injustices found in society, they make the injustices general. So we've accepted the status quo of legal plunder as a premise from which we're operating our government. So changing the elected people that we elect into these office is not going to make a bit of difference unless we go to the root of the problem, which is legal plunder. As soon as the plundered classes gain political power, they establish a system of reprisals against other classes. Homeland Security, Patriot Act, Military Commissions Act. Now, these don't abolish legal plunder. They merely protect the system that's been established.
It seems to me that the establishment of the various agencies that you just mentioned isn't an example of the plundered classes attempting to exact a general plundering of the entire system. This is the plundering classes of old attempting to establish a secure means of continuing to plunder. Is
Yes.
that what?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So we have not moved yet into the next stage that you are mentioning here. We're still in the stage of the few plundering the many rather than the many plundering everything.
Well, let's keep going. Let's see. Let's go. Thank you for that important distinction. I disagree, but respectfully, let me show you. It is as if it were necessary before a reign of justice appears that everyone suffer a cruel retribution, some for their evilness and some for their ignorance. It is impossible to introduce into society a greater change and a greater evil than this, the conversion of the law into an instrument of plunder. When the law itself legalizes taking from one and giving to under, redistribution of wealth, subsidizing other nations at our children's expenses, when laws are now used to lay a progressive heavy progressive tax system on the masses for the redistribution to those have-nots, that becomes a system of universal plunder. And when the whole world now depends on American generosity or philanthropy, if you will, and you notice none of those things came up when we had the government shutdown. The only thing that was going to suffer was military pay and age-old benefits and all those things. But we never talked about cutting off subsidies to other countries. We never talked about cutting food stamps. We never talked about cutting off the socialistic welfare that the unentitled received. Military, they were representing our country. The social security system, even though it is social, it was paid into by the recipients that are enjoying social security. So to threaten those people with a loss of payment is political jockeying to the extreme. What are the consequences of such a perversion? Here's the problem. In the first place, it erases from everyone's conscience the distinction between justice and injustice. No society can exist unless laws are respected to a certain degree. The safest way to make laws respected is to make them respectable. When law and morality contradict each other, the citizen has the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for the law. And that's where we're being pushed to right now. We're so compromised. What do? Do we obey the law? Do we go along with that Obamacare, or do we? And so we're being squeezed into the situation where we're actually losing our respect for the law and for people that make the law, and that's a recipe for absolute disaster. Especially when we are starting from a place of chaos and confusion to begin with, when we've lost sight of what the function of law really is. So these two evils are of equal consequence, and it would be difficult to choose between them. So do we compromise our integrity? Do we compromise the principles that the Founding Fathers set up for us to go along to get along, to maintain a sense of semblance of order, only to wake up in 10 or 15 years to find ourselves in the middle of a union of Soviet Socialist Republic, Red China, other communist or fascist dictatorships? Or do we break the law, which is against everything inside of us, because, you just don't do that? This is the exact same place the Founding Fathers found themselves. We are there. We've arrived at that place where we're going to have to choose one or the other. Do we remain in our integrity and in our sense of moral sense, or do we break the law? Now, unfortunately, when we break the law, we end up in jail or dead. Especially when there comes a time when the Military Commissions Act or the Patriot Act imposes, and the National Security Agency is spying on us, and all these things are rearing their head to protect its system. So it's gearing up for some resistance. And they're starting to get resistance. Tea Party, Occupy, there's resistance coming, they see it coming, so they're buying up billions of rounds of ammunition. They're putting the park police in front row and center. They've closed down the national parks. Of course, they reopened, but for a while there, you know, we saw some uprising. We saw the vets in Washington tear down those fences, and what did the government come right back and do? Put them right back up again. So, you know, we're entering into that day of conflict. So we are going to have to choose how this is going to go. And this is the conversation that is the First Amendment is intended to protect. This is the conversation the First Amendment is intended to protect. Because according to the principles of America, when a government becomes destructive to the end, it was established to secure the people have a right to alter or abolish it. Colorado Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same objective is designed to reduce the people under absolute despotism, the people have a duty to have this conversation about how they're going to handle what is being foisted upon the American people. So the nature of law is to maintain justice. It is so much so that in the minds of the people, law and justice are one and the same thing. There's a strong disposition to believe that anything lawful is also legitimate. A guy asked me a question. Well, now that the Supreme Court has ruled that Obamacare is constitutional, then we have to comply with it because it's the law. Well, I got that. That brings up, it begs a real serious question. What part of Obamacare did that judge rule on? Now, I could get off on a technicality on this. It didn't start out as a tax bill, but John Roberts says it's a tax bill, but all tax bills have to originate in the House, according to the Constitution. This bill didn't originate in the House, it originated in the Senate. Guess what? It's an unconstitutional law because its origin is flawed. But that issue wasn't raised, so that issue wasn't ruled on. The only issue that was ruled on was the narrow issue of individual mandate. So they came down to the individual mandate. That's the only thing that that judge ruled on in that case. How many pages long is that thing?
2,700 or something like that.
Okay, so because an individual mandate is held by John Roberts to be a constitutional exercise of the tax, we are just going to accept that a completely communistic healthcare system that has been foisted on the American people is constitutional because John Roberts said so. There's a flaw in that logic and reasoning. And like I said, I can come back with it, I can trump that, but that's not even a good one either. You know, just because, okay, yeah, the Constitution says that all revenue bills and bills for raising and spending originate in the House. So it's unconstitutional on its face. But this unconstitutional, it violates the Fourth Amendment because inside the health care bill, guess what? If you sign up for this health care bill, you voluntarily waive your right to be secure in your person's house's papers and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures. Right inside the bill. So you're going to invite the government to come into your house, no-knock warrants, because you're homeschooling your children. And you volunteered to waive that right. Well, here's why it's unconstitutional. You can't be forced to waive a right to accept a benefit. Supreme Court has said many times, if you're forced to waive a right to accept a benefit, if they're using force of law to force you to waive a right so that you can obtain a benefit, that law is unconstitutional. So, there's another reason. So the belief is so widespread that many persons have erroneously held that things are just because the law makes them so. Thus, in order for plunder to appear just and sacred to many consciences, it is only necessary for the law to decree and sanction it. So we live in an age where we think that just because Congress or the state General Assembly, because they happen to have a majority, they can write laws violating the Constitution, and those laws trump the Constitution. And I'm speaking specifically about the magazine holding more than 15 rounds. Somebody stuck in your pocket. Several of us, and several of us are here, bought and sold magazines in front of the courthouse here in Grand Junction the day that that law went into effect. We called the sheriffs, somebody called the sheriffs, told them that we were going to be there. Somebody in the audience dialed 911, ratted us out on purpose. We wanted to see what was going to happen. No one showed up. The cops know that that's an unconstitutional law. They didn't show up. But that doesn't mean the state highway patrolman, when he's searching your vehicle because he pulled you over for some reason, maybe a DUI, you had one too many, you get arrested, now they have the right to search your vehicle and find more than a 15-round magazine. Now see, the laws are being used to entrap us into a system, and we're not knowing how to resist this system because of our respect for the law. So it's the respect for the law that's getting us in trouble. When the law itself becomes the tool of the oppressor, then it makes life real difficult, to say the least. Thus, in order for plunder to appear just and sacred to many, it is only necessary for the law to decree and sanction it. Slavery, restrictions, and monopoly find defenders not only among those who profit from them, but also among them who suffer from them. This system is being championed by a lot of people that receive the benefits, a lot of people that go to church on Sunday and say Romans 13 says we're supposed to submit and obey every edict of government. 1 Timothy 2:13 says we're supposed to obey every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. So for these reasons we have to submit and obey. Well, how did that work for Nazi Germany? Who is responsible for the government when the government comes so far off the foundation that it was intended to be a delegation of authority that is a representative of the people? Who is ultimately responsible for that government? The Allied forces, because we're afraid he's the Antichrist? You know, ultimately, the power, because it is vested in and derived from the people are the final say. They have the last say, but they have to have this conversation, which is why we have the First Amendment. Again. And it's the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But let me rewind. It says, a well-regulated militia, necessary for the security of a free state. Well, who is the militia being used against? Someone that would oppose the security of a free state. Well, what happens when the very government becomes an instrument destroying the security of the free state? This is why the Dick Act was passed in 1903 and the National Guard was created. The federal government was making a maneuver, this is just my perspective of history, making a maneuver because they saw the Federal Reserve System coming in 1913. So they wanted to get all the power into the hands of the federal government, so they passed the Dick Act, which nationalized all the state militias. But the state militias still exist, and they're still alive in the counties, and this is the time in a nation's history we need to have that conversation about the state militias. And we need to have the conversation with the sheriff. When the federal government starts overstepping the boundaries of power, it's time for war. And that war first has to happen inside our minds. The war has to happen inside of our hearts. We have to choose our allegiance. Are we going to go along to get along? Or are we going to choose the principles of freedom and the principles that America was founded on? And this is the day of choice. This is the day we have to choose. Do we want slavery, restrictions, and monopoly? Do we want big banks controlling the government, telling the government what it needs to do? Do we want the banks telling the courts to foreclose on these houses and ignore all of the difficulties that they got themselves into by making fraudulent loans? Do we ignore the fact that the whole monetary system is based on fraud and theft and legal plunder? Or do we stand up and challenge our lawmakers here in the state of Colorado and say, stand up and start acting like representatives of the people and representatives of the Constitution that you took an oath to uphold and protect and defend? The answer is to restrict the law. The Founding Fathers, this is the whole point of the Constitution. The answer to our dilemma here is a restriction on the law. The law has to be restricted. Those that have the law in their hands have to have restraints on their power. That's the point of the Constitution. Not to give us rights, but to impose restrictions on their power. So learning how to use the Constitution, knowing how to recognize an unconstitutional act of the government, knowing how to raise the issue, These are the things that aren't being taught in school because it's inconvenient. I'm going to show you why they're not taught in school here in a minute. But the answer is to restrict the law. Law must be restricted to protecting all people, all liberties, and all properties. Law must be nothing more than the organized common